talk about. Okay, go ahead, Yasmin.
Okay, I was gonna say I define solidarity, I think, as like a shared struggle and unity under that struggle. So that's fine.
Okay, yeah, and yes, okay, I'm not gonna do it now. We're gonna break down shared struggle, but yeah, that's a great start. Thank you. Anyone else? I'll pull up the questions again.
I define it as general support for a cause within a particular group or movement. It doesn't necessarily need to be within a group, just for a cause, for specific goals.
That's a great answer. So how about who's in solidarity with us, and how did you all define the us as Palestinian, Arab, Muslim? Not to say that all of us, are, but just how do we? I think it's important to identify who we are, and then figure that out. So, who were the first people or groups of people we thought of for being in solidarity with? Let's just say Palestine. I think that's our common bridge, right?
I said the Irish.
Yeah.
I think they faced similar oppression in their history. So.
And you're getting to the why they were in solidarity, right? Is back to that shared struggle, right? And understanding. Yeah. Does everyone know why we're saying the Irish? Everyone, Yasmin, do you want to?
Well, they were, oppressed by the British, and we were under a British mandate. So.
Yeah, but I mean, what did they do recently that showed their solidarity with us?
Oh wait, I'm forgetting. Wait, I know what you're talking about, but I'm forgetting exactly.
In the summer, they very publicly, and like last summer when there was a lot happening around Palestine, they very publicly, like as a country, stated we are in solidarity with Palestinian people and against Israel. Right. And so just that public statement itself was like, wow. No, and I think something happened in the soccer game, right? Where right? Yeah. We're gonna look this up. But yeah, it feels like so long ago. But yeah, I think there was they showed their public support for Palestine soccer game too. And then it just of course caused a lot of outcry, but it was a heartwarming thing for people who support Palestine to see. Who else is in solidarity with us usually?
Well, I know that Iran is, because on the passports it says that like a holder of the passport can't enter like occupied Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Iran definitely is in solidarity with Palestine. Is that it gets a bit tricky in terms of like the politics, but on a just like general framework, they are. There's a couple Arab countries who do that. And it's funny because like Lebanon, for example, like if I can't get in, if I had a Lebanese passport or like, I have like an ID, I think I have a passport. I don't know. My parents have this stuff. But like if let's say I wanted to go to Palestine and I had to go through Israel, get the Israeli stamp, they wouldn't let me into Lebanon. Like I'm not allowed to have that. But it's ironic because so many, this is me as a Lebanese person hating on Lebanese politicians, so many of them individually work with countries like Saudi Arabia who are very close to Israel. So I love that that's a thing, but at the same time, like, how does this make sense? Because so many of our politicians are, enhanced with them, but that just goes back to the complexity of politics. What about like on very local levels? Who have we seen in solidarity with us in this country? What groups and organizations and identity groups are in solidarity with us?
I know the BLM movement is, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, definitely. On a national scale and the very local New Jersey, BLM Patterson is one of our biggest supporters and allies, especially on like local levels with PAC and other Palestinian orgs in this area, but also like showing up and really, really physically and visibly showed up to protests and anything that we asked them to talk about, right? They're there. other groups that I'm thinking of are like Indigenous communities. There's so many Indigenous organizations, communities, just people who very much understand and have felt so much of the similar pain that Palestinians have gone through, and show their solidarity. I'm also thinking about Latinx organizations. And so these are the three main ones that we're gonna cover today, right? Ways in which Black, Indigenous, and Latino populations, groups, identity orgs have been in solidarity with Palestine. So let's wrap up with the last question. How do we act in solidarity with others? How should we act in solidarity with others? And really what I wanna ask you all is, do you think our community, and as Palestinians, shows up to work in solidarity with others enough? And this is the challenging one a little bit.
Well, I know that 2 summers ago there were Black Lives Matter protests in Palestine, and there was a George Floyd memorial. That's anything in Ramallah.
Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I should have clarified. In Palestine, yes. I think Palestinians, and we're going to cover that because I love so much of the solidarity that comes out from Palestine. So yes, I think on an international level, Palestinians on the ground get it, 100%. What about in our communities and in this country? And I guess what I'm trying to challenge us here is, and I might answer the question how I see it, is that I see a lot of individuals and a lot of the youth, and the new Gen Z youth movement gives me so much more hope of solidarity. But in like talking about myself and some, I don't know, am I a different generation? Maybe, I guess. I'm almost 28. Does that make me a different generation? It's okay if it does. But I guess the organizing that I was always around in SJPs and MSAs and undergrad, I feel like we always asked and wanted so many people to show up for us, and we didn't show up in the same ways for others. And I know, especially in let's say talking about our parents' generations, I think there's a lot of colorism and racism that, you know, that bars like or hinders true unconditional solidarity, right? And I think that's what I want to get at, is that a lot of times we're like, well, yeah, we support them, but, and there's always a but. And how do we get ourselves beyond the but, right? To just support groups and organizations without our internalized isms coming through. And I'm really here talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. Right, there's a lot of anti-Blackness in our communities that isn't often addressed. And as individuals, I see a lot of us show up and very unconditionally support, let's say, the Black Lives Matter movement, or, you know, mergers of George Floyd and all of that. But I'll talk for my own family, right? There's a lot of, well, yeah, like they shouldn't have killed him, but look at what these people are doing, right? And even these people, and I'm talking about when there was the protest, the very rightful, I believe, should have existed, and then, you know, all the people are like, oh, how is they're you know, this idea of like they're looting or they're rioting or they're not doing anything good for themselves, right? And so I think a lot of that is rooted into the way in which we categorize, and this country has seen Black people and what they're supposed to do and not supposed to do. And I actually think it's ironic because you're basically saying like, not to show up for your people in that way, but if we do it for Palestine or in Palestine, it's justified, right? And so this is where I'm kind of getting, and this is where I feel like you all and younger generations are doing such a great job at, and I just want to encourage you to continue to practice this unconditional solidarity and not, you know, repeat the type of solidarity that maybe other people in our communities and around us do, and just genuinely show up when being asked to show up. In a way that does not overstep, right? And we can talk about allyship and the best way to do that, but in the way that you're needed. Any questions on these 3 points before we move on?
I don't have a question.
Yeah.
I think that's what I was trying to get at before. Like they're very like, I mean, I think our community is very self-centered and very like this is like they try to make everything about Palestine, not like I don't know. Do you guys remember like the Blackout Tuesday on Instagram? And like everyone was posting black squares. Like
Yeah.
I saw people on my timeline like say Palestinian lives matter. Like it's obviously not the time for that. You know,
Yeah.
that's what I was trying to say. Like they always have to make everything about the Palestinian cause, which is great, but like they should know there's a time and place, you know.
Agreed. Yeah. And there are ways to draw in those conversations. Like having conversations with people will be like, yeah, and I totally get that because I'm someone who follows what's happening in Palestine and very similar things happen, right? If we were doing it in that educational, conversational way, that's great. That's what solidarity is all about. But what you're talking about is that thin line of co-optation versus solidarity. And I hate it, and I would cringe at the hashtag Palestinian Lives Matter, not because they don't, but because that is something for the Black Lives Matter movement. We can create our own and we can bridge them together, right? But we don't need to take away from one person's struggle for our struggle to be valid and at the top. And this was actually something we dealt with a lot with like undergrad organizing. And someone mentioned it, and this term never left my head, is it's like we're operating under oppression Olympics, right? Like it's not a fight to who's the most oppressed and who deserves the most attention. We all are, it all sucks, and all of us are gonna come together to get attention. And sometimes one group needs to be elevated more than the other because of what's happening in the current climate, and that's totally okay. And that does not threaten or take away from ours. And I think that's what true unconditional solidarity is. And that takes a lot of trust and a lot of relationship building also to get there. So I'm hoping that that's what we can get out of this. Thank you, Yasmin, for bringing that up. So I want to start with Black Palestinian solidarity, and I'm going to focus on 2014 because that is what my scholarly work has focused on. So it's what I'm most comfortable talking about and what I love talking about and my passion. And what really drew me to 2014 was that I got into, this was me writing my master's thesis, right? And I remember coming in thinking I was gonna do some very academic, like other topic, and it just didn't feel right? It didn't feel like it's what I wanted to do. And I always wanted to have more of an activist lens to my scholarly work. And I was very much told that I couldn't do both. And I think that motivated me to do it, right? And by both, it was there was a lot of people who told me this wasn't a scholarly issue, right? But I think if we frame it under frameworks of solidarity and these shared struggles and the different overarching themes that bridge communities together, it very much can become a scholarly conversation, right? And that's not the point of this. The point of this is to figure out how the two bridge on larger theoretical frameworks, and that's going to help us understand how and why both communities come together in solidarity and the other communities we're going to talk about also. 2014 had a very, I would call it, it was a peak point of like resurgence of Black Palestinian solidarity. There was a lot of Afro-Arab solidarity and Black Palestinian solidarity before in the late 60s, right? And I think we've touched on this when we were learning about the Nakba and why it was such an important, although it was an awful defeat, it was an important political moment for Palestinians and for Palestine to be drawn into an international conversations about racism and imperialism or racism and colonialism, really. And it was that was very much due to a lot of important Black leaders in this country, like Malcolm X, who was able to go and see and bridge the parallels of whiteness and European, white supremacy and racism and colonialism and settler colonialism and all of those, the isms that he identified here and made the bridge to both. But 2014 is important and really piqued my interest because there was something new that emerged out of it. At least that I saw and felt was, and I also think it was just a generational thing also, right? It was a peak moment for our generation too. So this is something a bit too academic, and that's kind of why I started with the academic layout, but I do like showing it. This is basically, and I came up with this as a diagram to like be able to visually see how both communities come together and what leads to shared resistance and solidarity. And so we would start at the very bottom here, what I identified as one of the main root causes of Black and Palestinian oppression is racism and white supremacy. And you see all of the different things that leads into and out of, right? So that leads to colonialism, which can lead to imperialism. which can lead to illegal occupation, which can lead to shared resistance, right? Colonialism can also lead to neoliberalism, and that's a bit of a larger, unnecessary conversation for now. But neoliberalism is really this this facade that we're talking about of like, we're gonna go in to help under this liberalist idea, right? But we know there's a lot more behind that, and there's a lot more internal benefit to it. That's a very quick and not justified definition of neoliberalism, but just for a very quick overview, that can lead to human rights violations, which can lead to shared resistance. Racism can also lead to militarism, which leads to intense police forces and systems, which leads to state-sanctioned violence, which I'll cover. Does anyone know what state-sanctioned violence means? Actually, you all might know this already. Or just based off the context clues, what do we think we're talking about? State-sanctioned violence.
Jim Crow, Black Codes.
Say it again.
Like Jim Crow, Black Codes in the South in 1800s.
Yeah. What makes that state-sanctioned violence?
It wasn't necessarily. Actually, I don't remember if it was necessarily. I mean, I'm pretty sure it was local laws, but it was just endorsed or ignored by the state, by the southern states.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the endorsed part, actually both, you're right, endorsed and ignored, right? Violence that is justified because it is enacted by a state that allows this violence, right? And so when we're talking about, let's say, Israel, right? The violence enacted by Israel in the eyes of the Western world is seen as justified. It is state-sanctioned violence. So it makes it okay. It's not terrorism, it's a country's self-defense. But Palestinians fighting for their self-determination is deemed violent and terrorist, and it's not justified violence because it's not tied to a state. And Palestinians don't have their own state because Israeli occupation will allow them to, right? So all this, it's like very deliberate and very much like intentional. And so even talking about this country, right? Violence enacted by the National Guard, who is deployed into Ferguson, is justified because they're representatives of the state. But, and there is very little violence to even talk about here, but let's say a Black person going down to protest and maybe having to have a confrontation because they were being attacked, they're the ones who are at fault. They're the rioters, they're the bad ones. It's not the tanks and the military, it's the kid who threw the water bottle at a soldier, right? And so this is what I mean by state-sanctioned violence. This is where we see those parallels. It's who enacts violence and who's allowed to, and who's it justified for and not justified for. That leads to something called biopolitics, which is really about, the ways in which like race and personal identity gets tied into politics. And it's not necessary for this conversation, but it's something interesting if anyone wants to read into more. And can read, these all lead into prison industrial complex. They also lead to human rights violations, lead to something called the broken windows theory, which I also don't want to get into too much, but if anyone's very interested in this, let me know. I love this stuff. But basically what I'm trying to show with this is there are so many shared, there are so many themes and structures in place and isms, like a lot of these, like racism and militarism and state-sanctioned violence and imperialism, colonialism, that affect multiple communities in different ways, but still very similarly. All right, so this isn't to say that Black people and Palestinians deal with state-sanctioned violence and colonialism in the exact same way. They don't have to be in the exact same way, but there's a shared understanding of what's happening to them is because of this same larger umbrella theme. And that is what bridges communities to resist together and be in solidarity together. So we don't have to have the same exact issue or feelings or struggle or not struggle, or like the same exact things enacted on us, but because we understand that they come from this larger context, then we can understand that we must work together. Because there's no way one of us is going to defeat it alone, but if we come together, we're a lot stronger. And there's actually more of a more meaningful and more powerful resistance if we do come together. Does this make sense? This is always like the most academic part, and I really sometimes hate it, but I like the visual component of it. Any questions about this? Okay. So this is basically summarizing what we're saying, right? Is that similar structures of oppression, and those are the ones that we just saw in that chart, what can they lead to, right? And these are visuals, and Jenna, you pointed out the George Floyd Memorial, and so the one on the right is more recent from 2020. The one on the left is actually from 2014. This image of a Palestinian man. And I'm sorry, I didn't even put into context what happened in 2014. Does anyone know what I'm talking about in 2014? Okay, so do you all remember the murder of Mike Brown? He was a Black man in Ferguson, was murdered by a police officer, right? And of course, we know that many other Black men and people were murdered by police officers before then, but similar to 2020, right? George Floyd was not the first Black man to be murdered by police, but there was a feeling of enough is enough, right? We cannot do this, right? This was after Trayvon Martin, this was after countless other people, and the fact that there are more than names that I can memorize is really sad, right? But this was just kind of like, this is too much, and people in Ferguson really rallied and demonstrated, and we're going to demonstrate in the same area and like the perimeter of where he was murdered. And what happened was a lot of this news was being transported through Twitter to people internationally and overseas. And so Palestinians were able to see what was going on. And what happened was, whenever Black and brown people, and specifically Black people, want to come out in large demonstration for something very rightfully so, right? The United States government is going to deploy their military, because Black people are automatically seen as a threat and as violent, in the same ways that Palestinians are in Palestine, right? And other communities are, but specifically Black communities here. And so we start seeing these highly militarized police, National Guard, whatever it was, being deployed on the streets of Ferguson because people are protesting. And what that does is escalate it. That does nothing to help mitigate or help solve it, right? It's like there's a problem, and the government's solution to the problem is, we're gonna threaten you all, we're gonna scare you all away, instead of trying to fix the problem, we're just trying to make you all look like the bad guys, basically. And so we started to see, and some of the tactics that the highly militarized forces in Ferguson used against protesters were tear gas and stun grenades, and a lot of, again, very similar things that Palestinians have been subjected to. And a lot of this is because a lot of our police forces are trained by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, right? So our oppressors are talking to each other. Our oppressors are being trained by each other. And we were able to see that in the ways that they enacted violence on our communities who are trying to resist, or who are like, enough is enough and we're not taking this anymore. So this image on the left is an example of Palestinians saw what was happening, and they were tweeting support and just tactics, but very much a lot of support, right? And sometimes that's all you need in these moments, is just someone to be like, I feel you, I get you, keep going. And that's a lot of what happened. And I love this image, right? The Palestinian people know what it means to be shot while unarmed because of your ethnicity. #Ferguson, #justice. This is what I was talking about, biopolitics, right? Being attacked or shot or just targeted because of your race and ethnicity, automatically deeming you as something bad. The image on the right is a more recent one of 2020. Again, I feel like very similar. I felt like 2020 was very similar to 2014, where it was another enough is enough. It was another, I think 2020 could have been more Instagram maybe than Twitter, right? We're just a resurgence of, this is what's going on. People around the world being able to see it, and people around the world, especially Palestinians, being able to show their solidarity and their support. So these similar structures of oppression can lead to shared forms of resistance. And that is the way that I really think of solidarity, right? How do we understand these larger systems, and how do we use that understanding to come together and resist against them? So there's a lot of sharing of resistance tactics, because there are similarities that were seen in the protest and resistance spaces. And this tweet on the right is actually literal advice that was tweeted to people in Ferguson of how to deal with tear gas. So Mariam Barghouti, who, if any of you are interested, she actually is a speaker for one of our conference. Nobody knows this yet. I haven't announced it, but she's really awesome. And she's going to be talking about resistance on the ground. But she said, I remember when I used to get tear gassed, I used to just remind myself the pain will pass, to not collapse. So it helps. Someone else, so she started this thread and people started, feeding off of it. Of course, don't wash your eyes with water. Make sure you run against the wind to keep calm when you're tear gassed. The pain will pass. Don't rub your eyes. Solidarity with Ferguson. Remember to touch your face. Remember not to touch your face when tear gas or put water on it. Use milk or Coke. So these are like legit like tactics that are being shared. And I just thought this was like a beautiful and powerful thing. And you could see this person was like, people in Gaza are really tweeting information on how to handle tear gas to the citizens of Ferguson. Mind blown, right? And hashtagging Mike Brown. But I think it was a powerful moment for a lot of people to witness. And it feels like it's so far away, but something like Twitter, and as much as I can hate on technology, I think the one good thing that we can get out of it is something like this, right? So these were always really powerful. And I think if we start playing it, I think if I were to break down the three kind of larger themes that I really see bridging Black Palestinian solidarity together is this idea of biopolitics. So being targeted for your race and ethnicity, and the assumptions that have, not just assumptions, it needs a deeper word, right? But the state-sanctioned violence that comes out of that. So state-sanctioned violence is the other one, and then a hyper-militarization and policing forces that both communities are always met with. So we're just gonna watch this very short clip that kind of bridges all of it together.
What do Gaza and Ferguson have to do with one another? If you ask the Black and Palestinian artists and activists who just released a new solidarity video, a lot. Prominent figures like Miss Lauryn Hill, Danny Glover, and Alice Walker came together in this 3-minute video with one strong message.
When I see them, I see us.
Harassed, beaten, tortured, dehumanized.
Stopped and frisked, searched at checkpoints.
Administrative
You can hear the sound, right?
detention, youth incarceration.
The poem highlights the similarities in the violence and struggles faced by both communities. Palestinian legal scholar and organizer Noura Arikat got the idea for the video during the summer of 2014 when Gaza was being bombed and Ferguson erupted in protests after the police killing of unarmed 18-year-old Michael Brown. I asked her, what's the significance of solidarity between Black Americans and Palestinians?
The point is not to compare oppression. Blacks the world over have suffered from a legacy of racism much deeper than the contemporary Palestinian struggle. But the point here is that solidarity is a political decision on how to resist and how to survive in our respective fight for freedom.
And it's a solidarity movement that has been steadily growing. Earlier this year, activists from groups like Black Lives Matter, the Dream Defenders, and the Black Youth Project 100, among others, took a historic trip to the occupied West Bank in Israel. The purpose of the trip was for young Black leaders to connect with Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation. So what are the parallels the two communities find in common? Here's what Detroit-based writer and activist Christian Davis Bailey, who co-wrote the poem in the video, told me.
One of the biggest parallels I see between Black and Palestinian people is that we're each fighting really large systems of racism, militarized control, and state control. And we also see that violence against us is justified at the same time that our protests are criminalized or demonized.
And one of the on-the-ground campaigns between Black and Palestinian solidarity groups targets G4S, a British security company that provides technology for American and Israeli prisons. Already, they've seen major institutions like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the United Methodist Church, and Columbia University divest from G4S. So can joint solidarity campaigns ultimately lead to policy changes?
I love watching that video. It's a bit outdated. I'm sure there's a more contemporary one, but I don't know. There's just a lot of amazing people on that video, so I like to show that. Any questions to wrap up Black Palestinian Solidarity, or comments or things you want to add from what you've seen? I know that last year there was a lot of solidarity conversations also.
I don't know if we touched up on it or if you're going to touch up on it, but within the Arab community in general, this is kind of like, I don't know, different. Actually, it's like the direct opposite of solidarity, like Palestinian and Black solidarity. But there's like this level of discrimination and prejudice in the Arab community against not only Black people, but like other races in general that aren't Arab. And we are very judgmental. Like, as an Arab, like, we're pretty judgmental, not only towards our own race and people in it, but to like an extreme level with other people. So seeing stuff like this is honestly really like, it's just nice to see that there are good people in our like country and our culture and our race that are able to take themselves out from the collective when it comes to that just shared like racism towards Black people.
Yeah, no, 100% agreed. And we kind of touched on it in talking about the last question of who do we show up in solidarity with, right? And the anti-Blackness and racism and colorism in our community, right? 100% is real. And I think this the hopeful note that I was trying to end with is that I see a lot of the youth and a lot of great activists and organizers like the people in this video, and a lot of the youth really coming out and like undoing that, right? Even if we're not fighting all of the, let's be real, the ammos and the khaltos and like the older people in our community who we really see enact these, even if we're not spending our energy fighting them, we're gonna work to undo it so that the next generation, our generation, does not feed into that same ideology, right? And I think that's really important. But yeah, it's really important to point out, Jenna, is that we can't just romanticize this. We have to really talk about the issues within our community first and to undo it. So before we can engage in Black Palestinian solidarity, we have to disrupt the anti-Blackness and racism in our own families first, right? And so the next time there's a family gathering and someone's going to say something very anti-Black, or you know, a khalto or amto or whatever is going to tell some girl that she is too dark and no one's going to want to marry her if she doesn't, you know, stay out of the sun. That's all rooted in anti-Blackness and colorism, is that darkness is ugly and we need to be fair-skinned, right? And so these are the subtle ways that it can even enact. And there are ways to, I'm not saying go and like start fights with all your families, but there's ways to that we can start undoing this on personal levels and then on larger political levels. And if that's, I know we brought up this workshop series, which I want to spend some time on towards the end, but if that's an intervention you'd like to make with one of the workshops and, you know, combating anti-Blackness and colorism in our communities, I would love to help anyone do that. Any other questions or thoughts or comments about this? Okay. So just to wrap up, again, just a reminder that Israel trains the NYPD, right? The IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, trains the New York Police Department and probably other police departments in the country. Hi, Ezra. No problem. We were talking about solidarity for today, so feel free to jump in with any comments or thoughts throughout. But Angela Davis is another amazing activist and scholar who focuses on Black Palestinian solidarity. If you're interested in this, I'd recommend her book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And this is from that book, a quote from that book, right? Is that the Israeli police have been involved in the training of US police. So there is a connection between the US military and the Israeli military. And therefore, it means that when we try to organize campaigns in solidarity with Palestine, when we try to challenge the Israeli state, it's not simply about focusing our struggles elsewhere in another place. It also has to do with what happens in US communities. And I think that's the really powerful part of solidarity, right? Is that it's not just that's what separates it from a savior complex, right? It's not just like, oh, these people need saving, let me go help them. It's that what's happening to them is very much in line to what happens with me and is actually directly correlated to what happens to my community. And so me showing up for another community is also showing up for my liberation, because our liberation is collective. And this is like that. It's just a quote that I feel like perfectly emphasizes all of that. And Angela Davis is amazing. So she always puts out great stuff. this other image I also found very powerful, right? And I think, and this Tefpo quote is what I was trying to talk about state-sanctioned violence. Does anyone want to read the quote? So I'm not the one reading it.
Sure, I'll read it. A Palestinian kid throws a rock at a tank, and instead of speaking out against the people who sent the tank to the village, we classify the villagers as the villains. A young black man or woman in Ferguson throws a water bottle at an armored vehicle, and suddenly they are in the wrong, as if a line of soldiers with M16s isn't occupying a suburban neighborhood. Tefpo.
Tefpo is a great artist also who was on the lines of Ferguson, right? And he's really calling out state-sanctioned violence here. Who is deemed the violent, the backwards, the terrorist, and whose violence is deemed okay. So here it's talking about a water bottle and armored vehicle. In Palestine, we could place the context of the stone and the rock, right? Is that the stone is such a, scary weapon to what? To an Israeli tank, to IDF soldiers who are strapped and highly militarized, but they're not the ones who are seen as violent. It's the kid with the stone who's seen as violent. And this image that I put here was always very powerful to me because, this is and I hate that they use young man, right? Because these are boys, these are children, and even calling them man and not boys takes away from their childhood, honestly, and is a whole nother conversation. But these two young boys, very different places. One's in Gaza, one's in Ferguson, but like they have the same facial expression, and that always caught my attention. This feeling of pain and trauma and anger and frustration, like literally and visualized or expressed in such a similar way, I think speaks for itself, right? Speaks to all of what solidarity is for itself. So there's a lot of these powerful images, and we can make a lot of these correlations with them. Okay, so that's wrapping up Black Palestinian solidarity. Now I want to go into Indigenous solidarity, right? In ways in which many Indigenous communities have been in solidarity with Palestinian communities, and ways that I wish more Palestinian communities would understand to be in solidarity with Indigenous communities. Because in the same way there's a lot of anti-Blackness in our community, there's a lot of confusion about our presence in this country and on this land, right? And I think that in my experience, there's been a lot of not wanting to, come to terms with the fact that this country is also a settler colonial state, right? That Christopher Columbus did not discover anything like we were taught, that Christopher Columbus was and was a European settler colonialist who came in and viewed the native indigenous people of this land as not good enough, was like, we're gonna make this land ours, and enacted many similar practices that Israel enacted on Palestinians, of erasure, of displacement, of forcing native indigenous people into one area, and even them not giving true sovereignty and true prosperity, which is the very minimum. And then under this idea of we're better, we're more advanced, we're not backwards, right? We're not the savages. We're gonna make this land and this country to be great. And then this facade of democracy, right? And all of these things. There's so many similarities to make here. And the ones that I want to specifically focus on are settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and an erasure and co-optation of identity. Right, there is a huge erasure of Native Indigenous identities, but then for Halloween, you see people dressing up as Native Indigenous people, which is so just offensive and a slap in the face to Native Indigenous people of this country, right? It's not a costume. It's not something you can say the Indians and the Pilgrims and, like these terms that have been so normalized almost as fun party ideas, but are actually very much rooted in settler colonialism and genocide, right? And we see very similar things happening in Palestine, which we're gonna focus on. But I wanted to start off because I always love this video. This is a video of an indigenous group of people, and I forgot exactly where, showing up to a protest for Palestine, like last year, and offering a native indigenous dance as their way of solidarity, right? As their way of showing their support to Palestine.
Palestine must be free. Occupation is a crime. Free Palestine. Occupation is a crime.
That was very short, and I wish I could find longer ones, but I love that video, and I love everything that it represents. So I bring up this image again, and I think we already went over this image, but to make the parallels of the land lost, right? The physical land being lost from Native Indigenous communities and being taken over, right? So we can understand the visual of Palestinian land being lost and taken away, right? From this to this, right? To having nothing, to the yellow being almost completely erased and just little like droplets there. And even then, right, there's still the lines over it mean they're under Israeli control. They're not fully sovereign or fully under their own control, right? So that we see the same concept of land being taken away and land lost is exactly what happened to Indigenous communities here, right? And it's really important, I think, for us to also learn about. Let me just see if I did not put. Hold on, I'm gonna find this real quick because there's the image of that shows the land in the U.S. also being taken away. Let's see if I can find it. The problem is we can't always find these images. But if you kind of just do a quick like Google search to really like understand how this land looked like and was split up before the US and European kind of colonizers came in, you'll see a lot of like indigenous, I can't find it right now, I'll try to find it after, but like their tribes, right, and nations and where they were before and where they had to get pushed out of to make way for the states that we understand now, right? So just again, not taking away the history of this country and the states that we call states and the ways that we have split up the land now is not always what it was, right? In the same way that in Palestine, we know is not Israeli cities that have come and taken over Palestinian villages, right? We understand that context, and so I want to make sure we put that in the context of this country also. And then I want to focus on cultural appropriation, right? Because I think that's something that bridges both communities in terms of erasure, right? So erasure being like, Native Indigenous languages are not spoken or taught in schools, even though this was their land. The same way Arabic is, it's not a language that's being held up, right? Or like schools teaching it in, let's say, Palestine, right? Or what is now called Israel. And then we can also talk about the appropriation of Palestinian culture by Israel to claim that this culture was always theirs, right? So that there is no justification, or there's no, where's the word I'm trying to look for here? There's no one that can like fight against Israel's presence if they can claim, they quote claim or take or appropriate cultural practices of the land, right? Instead of naming them as Palestinian, and maybe they can't be completely erased in the way that they've tried to erase Palestinian history, they can co-opt it though to make it their own. So I'm talking about food, talking about dance, talking about thobes. So, and this was the very recent one, right? How many people saw this post by Miss Universe? What was it? Before we watched the video, what happened?
They had the Miss Universe contest in Israel, and they tried to like use our culture to like make them interesting because they don't have a culture of their own.
Yeah, and I don't know if the actual contest itself or they like went and visited Israel, and this was part of, I understood it as so much of media attention was on Palestine for like the first time, and Israel was not necessarily painted in the way that Zionist propaganda wants it to be, and Palestine being a part of social justice issues and all of that. So there was a lot of like, I think, a scramble for media attention on Israel, right? And come visit Israel and see how great we are. And so the Miss Universe contestants went, and she posted and we'll watch the video, but she posted a lot of these very Palestinian cultural things and tagged it, hashtag Visit Israel, right? So this claim, and for anyone who doesn't know about Palestinian culture, how are they going to know that it's Palestinian and not Israeli, right? And that's the propaganda and appropriation that both I think are very similar to Native Indigenous communities here and Palestinian communities. You're right, Yasmin. It was, the pageant itself was in Israel. I didn't catch that. But so what are like thoughts that we have about this video, and how can we relate some of it to larger ideas of indigeneity, right, and indigenous cultural appropriation? Or even just framing, I thought that was a loaded question. Maybe just starting with, what does being indigenous mean?
I don't know how, I think there's a lot of definitions. I don't have a single one, but I just wanted to relate this to a quick conversation I had, very short conversation I had. I go to public school, Ridgewood Public School, and on Friday, I believe it was Friday or Thursday, having a conversation with this kid, and he said, trying to remember the exact words, he said that, I think he was talking about hummus, and he's saying it was like Israeli, whatever, you know, usually you hear that stuff because there are a lot of Israeli companies that do produce hummus. And I think that relates to the fundamental problem, which is a lack of knowledge. And I think that's the reason that, you know, fortunately in this case, there were people who noticed it, but, you know, in a not too different world, nobody might have noticed that it was a different culture. Nobody might have pointed it out. Nobody might have cared. And nobody would have known essentially that this was a different culture that they were misappropriating. That seems to be the underlying problem behind this whole conflict, really, is people just not knowing what's going on, not caring because it doesn't affect them. And, you know, we ask ourselves, how much do we know about the other crises that exist in the world? How much do we know what's going on in, you know, Rwanda, Bosnia, all those other places where there's continuous conflicts? Like, do we know the conflict behind Taiwan and Hong Kong? Do we know what's going on in Ukraine right now? So there's really, you can't blame everyone for not knowing what's going on in the whole world. What's going on in Africa, for example. But again, I think that's just the underlying problem. Yeah, it's very difficult, but I think it's up to the communities behind each of these crises who are suffering to be able to inform the public.
Yeah, and I think the lack of education, exactly it, and it's a lack of education that's brought on by a deliberate erasure of the proper education that's needed and of the culture, right? If from the very beginning we have always named hummus and falafel as Palestinian, then we wouldn't have given way for Israel to claim them as theirs. And that's a very deliberate part of settler colonialism and colonialism in general, and imperialism, etc. But this educational piece is exactly right. And I think it's just as much on us and our communities to educate as it is for others to put in the work to learn, right? And this is where that back and forth goes. So Musab, you had a great opportunity to educate someone about it, and that person's gonna go and maybe tell someone else and be like, actually, you know what? I was just told that this is Palestinian, there's this whole thing going on that we don't even know about, and let's go learn more about it, right? You did your part and now they finish it. And that's exactly the solidarity we're talking about, of what kind of solidarity do we put out there? And you hit on it exactly. Do we know enough about what's going on? And so we can do that, some of that work to look it up and get resources, and we can ask for clarifications when needed. And I think that's a great way to start combating things like appropriation on a smaller scale and level. Any other thoughts or questions about this?
Yeah, I wanted to say that like this whole thing about like trying to take our culture as theirs, it just pushes their agenda to like try to make, like they always say, oh, we're cousins. Oh, our cultures are so similar. Oh, we're cousins. But it's not that. Like they're actually taking our culture and appropriating it and claiming it as theirs.
Yeah, and that's all to continue the propaganda and justification of taking over the land, right? And it all really comes back to land theft and erasure and displacement. You can physically displace people, but you also have to psychologically, right, and culturally displace or take over, right? And I guess that's a solution, right? Well, maybe we can't erase the whole culture, but let's just start claiming it as ours, and nobody will question it anymore, right? No one will question our rightfulness to this land. And I think in similar ways, and when I'm talking about Indigenous communities, I'm not just talking about Indigenous US communities, right? There's a lot of Indigenous communities around the world who have been pushed out or been displaced by, the decades of European colonialism around the world, right? And so there's a lot to learn about of, Indigenous groups in Latin America and South America, Indigenous groups in our own Arab countries, right? And the ways in which they might be treated, or that certain things could be appropriated. We don't know where they come from. There could be a lot of cultural practices we do that come from a very Indigenous lesson, right, that we don't even realize. And so there's a lot of education and work that we can put in to dismantle that too. Moving on from appropriation. Okay, so that kind of, not to say that I know I focus more on Black Palestinian solidarity, but again, that's the personal knowledge and passion coming. But any other questions that we want to talk about or parallels to draw between Indigenous and Palestinian communities specifically? Do we feel comfortable moving on? I'm going to take that as a yes. So now talking about, and I think this is what is least talked about and we shed the least light on, is Latinx solidarity. And maybe it's me coming from California and there being a lot of conversations about the border and about I think I saw a lot more of that solidarity than in California than I have in Jersey, and I think that's just a very geopolitical thing. But I think it's one that's maybe both communities have not worked so much together yet, and there's a lot of potential for, and that's why I want to focus on it a little bit. And the three main things that I see bridging both communities is control of borders, right? So border conflicts and talking about that, not even conflict, just someone putting up a border and enforcing it. Freedom of movement and identification. And by freedom of movement, I mean physically being able to move across, and this is very tied to identification, across whatever area you are in without fear of being stopped and asking for identification or paperwork that you might not have, because that paperwork is supposed to prove whether or not you're allowed to be in that place, right? So, and I'm just going to keep going because that's going to help explain. What I want to start with is, I want you to look at both of these, the left side and the right side, and tell me if you can figure out which one is what or where. If you can, are they different or are they the same? Janine?
Okay, so on the left is obviously the Palestinian one, and then on the right is like the Mexican border, I think.
How did you tell the difference?
Well, I just know that the Mexican border isn't like as legit as the other one, so.
Okay. Yeah,
And also
actually,
I've seen this in person, like the one on the left. I've seen that in person, so I know what it looks like.
Nice. Okay, yeah, but so you were able to make those very distinct differences, but on a general level, do they look that different?
I mean, kind of like
I
that,
guess
like the one. I mean, not really, but like on the left, like I could tell like a big difference because like on the left, like it's just you know a lot more secure. Like it's like taller. It's like more. It's made out of like different materials and everything like that.
yeah. Yeah, okay, you all are way more advanced. So usually when I do this with people, and I love this, but usually when I do this with people, they're like, it looks exactly the same to me. I can't tell the difference. So I think that just proves all of your like insightfulness and detail and just knowledge about both. You are right though, the details are very different. And this is actually the solidarity conversation, right? Is that the details might look different, but the main goal of both of them is the same, right? Is that one is on the Palestine-Israel border and one's the US-Mexico border. And the point is to keep certain people out, or not out in the border, to keep certain people out of that border, right, from coming in. Both of these borders are socially constructed, right? They are man-made. They were made for a specific political mission to keep certain people out, the quote undesirables, so that we can call people quote illegal and like decide where they can and cannot be and whether or not they can come in. And all of it is under the facade of security, right? That these people are going to harm us and going to take away from us, and we can't allow them to be here. And it's ironic because it's the settler colonial projects that come in and put these borders and claim that there's threats against them. Right? Because if we really go back to indigeneity and this land, a lot of, Mexico's and the land of what is now called Mexico was very much part of a lot of indigenous communities in the US before these borders were made. Right? So we learned about how Arab borders were very socially constructed and lines that were drawn. There's a lot of similarities here, and all of a sudden communities are supposed to be divided by this border, even though many years ago they could have just maybe came in and out, and it was communities and families and tribes working together, and this border didn't exist before. And so that's kind of the main motive of this, is that the details might look different, and I like this. You all helped me kind of figure this out of the borders, but the goal of the border is still very much the same, right? And is enacted by the same oppressor or type of oppressor. And we see this like done, it's not even like hidden, right? There's just very publicly supporting each other. Does anyone wanna read the part on the right and then Netanyahu's tweet? I'm sorry, the part on the left and then Netanyahu's tweet. Or just summarize it. We don't have to read the word for it. You can also read it if nobody wants to. It's too much of my own voice. But so basically Trump held up Israel's walls as a model for expanding the US-Mexico border, and was cheered on by Israeli former Prime Minister Netanyahu, right? So you can see from his tweet on the right, the way that he did that. He literally says, Trump is right. I built a I'm trying to just shorten this, sorry. I built a wall along Israel's southern border. It stopped all illegal immigration. Great success, great idea. Right? They just literally even tweet the same way. I feel like that's something that literally sentences that Trump would say. But they and again, this goes back to our oppressors talk to each other. Our oppressors rely on and speak to each other. So that means that our resistance has to rely on and speak to each other as well. The land split by the US-Mexico border wall is lined with towers patrolled by Israeli weapons manufacturer Elbit Systems, while Israeli companies Elta and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing these right, honestly, and occupation profiteer Caterpillar are vying for contracts to get their hands on the wall. So this goes back to some of the BDS conversations too. When we're talking about what companies to, target for BDS, one of them is Caterpillar, because Caterpillar, they own the bulldozers that are gonna help put up the walls, that are going to help displace people's homes. There's so many other like manufacturing companies. G4S was mentioned in the video we watched. They create or help create the prison systems, right? So there's so many like larger corporations and tech corporations that that make a lot of money from oppressors, right? And from oppressors who put up things like walls that need extra security and patrols and infrastructure to create it and things like that, right? And so, and that's kind of that's a really big parallel, and I think we haven't gotten it to the larger conversational level on like society that I think we can get to, right? But we can start it, and we can start it by bridging these similarities between our communities and other communities who are faced by lack of movement and borders and separation walls. There's two very quick videos that I think are important to talk about when talking about the walls and the similarities of them. So we'll watch the first one that's specifically about the wall that was put up by Israel around its borders after or during the Second Intifada under this facade of security. And then there's this great video of someone talking about how she really got into, or they really got into Latinx and Palestinian solidarity and what brought her attention to what's happening in Palestine.
I'm standing in front of one of the most infamous man-made structures in the world. In some places, it's as high as 8 meters, making it twice the height of the Berlin Wall. It runs 280 miles long, basically the distance between Philadelphia and Boston. It's been under construction for the past 13 years, and it's still not done. Oh, and according to the International Court of Justice, this wall is completely illegal. I'm in the occupied West Bank, where Palestinians have been living under Israeli military occupation since 1967. The wall is one of the most imposing parts of that occupation. Israel began building the wall in the early 2000s during a wave of suicide bombings that targeted Israelis. The Israeli government calls it the separation barrier or the security fence and says the aim is to keep out Palestinian attackers. But thousands of Palestinians still manage to get across every day looking for work. So if the wall doesn't stop people from crossing, then what does it do? Let's take a look at the root of the wall. You'd think a wall meant to stop people from entering its territory would be built on Israel's border, but 85% of it is inside the occupied West Bank on Palestinian land. International law says it's illegal to build settlements like these on occupied territory, but this is one of over 200 settlements and settler outposts housing 500,000 Israelis in the occupied West Bank. Technically, these settlers live outside of Israel proper, but the wall has shifted the boundary between Israel and the West Bank to swallow up more Palestinian land. When the wall is completed, an area the size of Chicago will have been added to the Israeli side of the wall. While settlers who live west of the wall are full Israeli citizens with rights and benefits, the Palestinians who live in that same territory have none. This is the village of Dab'a near Qalqilia. It's just one of many Palestinian villages that lost at least half of its land to the wall. Israel used dynamite to clear the path for the wall, damaging homes and the local school. In some parts, the wall is made of concrete, and in other parts, it's fencing, depending on the proximity to Palestinian homes. I'm standing at a gate that Israel only opens once a year to allow villagers to harvest their olives, which was once their main source of livelihood. What happens when the wall cuts right through a neighborhood? This entire Palestinian village called Hizma has been walled off from the rest of Jerusalem, except for the homes of a couple of Palestinian families that got stuck on the Israeli side of the wall. And people here aren't even allowed to go visit their old neighbors. Hizma is technically part of Jerusalem, meaning it's on Israel to provide the villagers services like trash pickup and security, but it doesn't. And the villagers are basically forced to fend for themselves. You'd think the biblical city of Bethlehem would have a booming tourism industry, but here you can find one of the clearest examples of how the wall has devastated the Palestinian economy. Many businesses have shut down and families have left. When it's completed, Bethlehem will be completely cut off from its agricultural land, its churches, and more. The wall, along with a series of illegal Israeli settlements, are physically strangling the city, and it can't expand. And because of the wall, most Palestinians coming from Bethlehem cannot take this road to nearby Jerusalem. You can only get through this checkpoint if you have a special permit, which most Palestinians can't get. So there you have it. This wall, a fixture of the occupation, has destroyed neighborhoods, strangled the economy, and illegally grabbed more Palestinian land. Palestinians call it the apartheid wall. And the question is, how long will it stand?
So I think what's really important to get from this and why it's called apartheid wall is that Israel very much deems this a security wall, right? But as she pointed out, if it was for security, right, why is it on Palestinian territory, right? I mean, all of it's Palestinian territory, but you in the West Bank at least, right? And that the real intention of the wall is to take more land, right? To build off more territory for Israel, to cut off Palestinians' economic livelihood and prosperity, because again, she pointed out so many things that people rely on for work, for money, etc., that they can't access anymore because of this wall. And is really like a psychological component of this, of controlling where people are and where people can go, and the land that was once theirs, where families who would just cross a street and have dinner together are automatically just like so far apart from each other because of this. So there's also this emotional, psychological component to being physically controlled that the occupiers are very well aware of and do on purpose.
All those crazy things, right? Like knowing about Albert Systems and how like that it's an Israeli company that's funding the apartheid wall in Palestine, but it's also gotten just this year $115 million for the US-Mexico border, and other connections just in terms of like narratives, right? So narratives of like Zionism and Manifest Destiny, what I thought was crazy was how the racialization of Mexicans has transplanted to the other side of the world so much that Israelis call Palestinian neighbors Mexicans, right? And they use that word, and that's like crazy. But for me, it was really being able to educate myself and do my own research, like not expecting anyone to educate me, but still, asking questions and learning together and just showing my solidarity, because this is part of something so much bigger, right? Like we are probably in the most chaotic moment of like history right now. And we have decisions to make, like we're hurting Mother Earth, like things are really bad right now, and we have important decisions to make in our everyday lives and how we practice resistance. And part of that is, right, doing our own work, doing our own research, understanding our positionalities and working from our positions of privilege. And for me it was like, okay, I have this knowledge that now I can share with other Chicanos and other Latinos who, when you go to marches, you don't see. And it's like, come on, y'all, we can do better. But that's really what it's been for me.
That was very quick, but I don't know, I really appreciate this video and what she shares in it. Any thoughts about what she just shared? Similarities, comments? Did we like what she shared? Or questions about the borders of the wall? Should we just move on? Are we good with this to move on? We like understand the similarities of border and separation.
I'm standing in front of one of the most
Okay, so this is just a quick image, right, to really show the similarity of the freedom of movement bullet point and the control of movement, right, where, and this is from Visualizing Palestine, just specific to Palestine, right, where people are allowed to go and be based off of their identification cards, right? So, and there's a lot of conversation about, and in Jersey, for example, of driver licenses for undocumented people, right? So this idea of like being undocumented, or what other people call, quote, illegal, right? Which we don't use. No one's illegal on stolen land, but of being undocumented, and that, you know, making it very difficult to practice everyday stuff because you don't have this identification system. And something like getting an ID is so normalized and just seen as like, yeah, you just do that. But could that have had any, where did the origins of getting an ID come from? Right? Is it to control people and where they're allowed to go and what they're allowed to be tied to, right? I'm not saying that like it's, I think there's a lot of challenges here that we can challenge ourselves to really question a lot of things that have become so normalized, and how in many ways they're used to dehumanize people, especially a conversation around identification. And so this is a visual of where people are and what they're allowed to do based off the type of identification that they hold. So Gaza ID holders, for example, are barred with few exceptions from leaving Gaza or living any other part of occupied Palestinian territories, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So imagine like that, I mean, that's basically like you're a US citizen, but you can only be in California. And California is awful to live in, and you're not allowed to leave because of the type of ID you hold. And you can't go to another part. Let's say you used to, your family's in Texas or something, and you literally can't go there because of this identification that you hold. I actually think this next, do I have it on this slide? No. I had, well, I'm gonna pull this up because there's this great link, yes, to an Instagram. And if you all don't follow Visualizing Palestine, I would very much recommend that you do. They have this great graphic on Instagram that like visually shows and explains how Israeli citizens versus Palestinians are allowed to move. So let's talk about the West Bank, since we're on the West Bank and the border wall. Look at the two differences between the people. Can I hop in my car and drive to Jerusalem? Let's pause it. So a Jewish citizen of Israel, born in an Israeli settlement, very easily can hop in his car and go to Jerusalem. You can do so on roads designed to bypass Palestinian communities and facilitate your community. You literally have a road that's like, oh, you can go here, and you don't have to deal with the checkpoints or the extra blockages or whatever it is that Palestinians have to deal with. A Palestinian ID holder who's born in a Palestinian village in Area C cannot just hop in a car and go to Jerusalem. You need a rarely issued Israeli permit that's generally time limited, and even with a permit, you're going to face checkpoints or you're likely to experience delays and humiliation. Right, so very little things that we take so much for granted, like getting on a plane and going somewhere. Not even forget a plane, getting on a car and going somewhere is not simple. And sometimes we don't realize it because maybe our communities, maybe we're privileged enough to have a passport and ID, etc. But there are a lot of communities and people in this country who aren't allowed to, right? And who can't get on a plane and go somewhere, can't get in a car and go somewhere, because if they're stopped by police and they realize they don't have the right identification or etc., it's going to be really bad for them. And so they just are physically limited to a specific place because of this socially constructed idea of who is allowed where. And those are the similarities to make between a lot of Latinx communities here who are really fighting this struggle right now. There's also a lot of conversations about prison industrial complex and detention centers that can be made very similar between Palestinians and Latino communities here, right? And this was actually a conversation as 2017 Israel Apartheid Week. I just found the flyer of it and I thought it was really cool, and I wish I was actually able to attend the event. But it's called Prisoners, Incarceration and Illegality in Palestinian Latinx Communities. Right? So making a lot of these parallels of ways in which the Israeli military can just grab and detain a Palestinian and arrest them for, just because there's quote reasonable grounds. It's very similar ways that ICE can show up and grab and detain a family for if they find reasonable ground, right? Or if they, you don't have this identification, you come with us, right? Families getting separated, people being forced into places that aren't home, right? So these are, I'm not going to focus too much on this, but there's a lot of other systems that we can really relate both. This was just a very cool, I actually have a friend who is doing a lot of his PhD work in Oaxaca and showed me when he was there for his field research, took a bunch of pictures, and this was also sent by some of these were also sent by someone who visited Oaxaca and saw a lot of these images, who's like supports Palestine, and also sent them to me. But you see a lot of visuals that are showing Palestinian solidarity, right? So in the same way we see a lot of Palestinians using the wall to point pictures of like Black Palestinian solidarity and communities they support. We see a lot of this in Mexico also, of people who really understand the shared struggle and support Palestine. And these are always just good reminders. Sometimes you feel very alone and you feel like it's defeating, but then you have these visuals of solidarity that, at least for me, are very refreshing and heartwarming and motivating too. Okay, and so what I really wanted to end with, and this was a PowerPoint that I did for an organization that has no idea about Palestine, who was really asking to bridge a lot of conversations about Palestine. And what I thought was really important, and this is where I see the most similarity to the Indigenous struggle, is what is our ultimate goal here? What are we really, really fighting for? What do we want people who are supporting Palestine to be fighting with us for? And I say this because a lot of times we have allies who support Palestine, but support Palestine in this way that doesn't identify the right of return, really, right? The right of, it's not just like Palestinians deserve peace, which they do. It's that justice, what justice means for Palestinians is to be able to return to the homes that they were pushed out of and the villages they were pushed out of. It's not, let's have peace between Israel and Palestine, which is very important, of course, but for that peace to happen, we need reparations. We need to be given back what was stolen from us. And I think that is where Palestinian solidarity gets difficult for many communities, because it stops there. You know, we're good with peace, but it's like, wait, what do you mean getting back what was taken, right? Because that seems like way too complicated. It's really not. And again, knowing the history shows that Palestine was a land where so many diverse people lived very happily and comfortably together, right, under a Palestinian identity, but without one person being repressed or confined or controlled because of their identity. And that's really what we're trying to get back to. And this is a very similar conversation we're talking about here. We can't just very like, what is the word I'm looking for? Like very just subliminally or just superficially, that's what I'm looking for, superficially be in solidarity with Indigenous communities here if we're not ready to face and address the fact that we are complicit in a settler colonial project. And what Indigenous freedom and liberation in this country really means is that Indigenous communities deserve to have their land back. What positionality that puts us in, we can figure out, but that's not going to take away from me being in very strong and real solidarity with Indigenous communities to get their land back too. Because we can't be fighting that for Palestinians, but not fighting that here or anywhere globally around the world. And so this is where it's both sides. It's what kind of solidarity do we want? It's solidarity that's deep enough and real enough to fight for our right of return. And the solidarity that we give is going to be the same. This goes back to Black communities too. If we're not fighting for reparations against slavery, then we can't claim to be in solidarity with Black communities here, right? And in the same way that we're fighting for this, we have to fight for other communities too. And I'm not saying it's easy, and I'm not saying like it's just that simple and it's like here or there, right? Obviously this means conversations, but I just want to make sure that the solidarity we enact and the solidarity we act for is a lot deeper than where it can be at times. And so, and this is going to explain what we really mean by right of return.
The right of return is one of the biggest sticking points in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But what is it? Palestinians, who make up the world's biggest refugee population, say they have a right to go back to the homes, the land they were expelled from when Israel was created in 1948. Israel says it doesn't have to accommodate Palestinians who fled their homes. Returning Palestinians would outnumber Israeli Jews, and that would alter the Jewish character of the state. But UN Resolution 194 says Palestinian refugees should be allowed to return to their homes, and that those who choose not to should be compensated for the property they lost. Where exactly is Palestine? To answer that,
So it's very short. But it's basically tying back to this idea of this understanding that Palestinians deserve to return, and this understanding that other communities also deserve to return. And that's where our ultimate goal should always be. So what I wanted to end with is this conversation. And we don't have to, I know there's been a lot of information right now, so we don't have to sit and unpack it, but what I'm hoping you all can get out of from this conversation, this PowerPoint, is how can you bring awareness about Palestine and also be in solidarity with other communities? How can we be doing both at the same time? So Musab, you shared an example of an educational conversation you had with someone about hummus and where its origins really lie from. How can we bridge that conversation with another conversation about indigenous communities here? Like, yeah, you didn't know that was happening in Palestine, but wait till I tell you that so many similar things actually happen in this country to so many Native and Indigenous people, right? And the creation of this country. Or you're talking about, yeah, the police, like, you know, the IDF is killing innocent Palestinian boys, and isn't that very similar to what to the type of police brutality that Black communities also face in this country, right? And not that, like, and again, it's okay to sometimes just talk about Palestine and just talk about Palestine, and sometimes we need to just talk about Black communities and just talk about Black communities. This idea of sometimes based off the current climate, one community's conversation is elevated, and that's okay. But when it's not that peak current climate, and when it does feel like this, you know, this lull of activism, we can be bridging both at the same time. So I'm gonna leave it up to you all if we want to try to answer this question right now, if we want to talk about the workshops, and I do want to check in a little bit about ACE in general for you all and how you're feeling about it and your capacity with this internship. But it's up to you if we want to answer this question or if we want to just go into like logistical conversation, because I know there's been a lot of information since 11. So we can pause here and just go to the logistical conversations, or we can answer that question. It's up to you.
I don't have a preference. We can keep discussing what we've been doing, or we can go over logistics.
Okay, is everyone okay with that? Talk about just the ACE team in general and the workshop project. Okay. So, okay. So I wanted, yeah, how are you all feeling about the commitment with this team? Because me and Anya are always in we don't want to feel like we're not giving you enough to do, and then we don't want to feel like we're overwhelming you with things to do. And so we want to check in about the workshop projects we presented and you all taking on a workshop and doing some of that work. Does that feel too overwhelming? And it's okay if it did. We can work on it together.
I don't think so. As long as I think we're talking about what our goals are so everybody knows clearly what they need to do. I don't think actually doing it is extremely difficult.
Okay. So what would help facilitate like putting it, doing it and putting it all together? Because I don't want it to feel like you're doing a lot of this work like extra over, outside of these meetings, but the goal of the internship was not just the monthly meetings, although I feel like this has been the thing we've most sustained the most. But I know that there's a lot going on, there's a lot that everyone's doing. So I guess I'm asking what would be most helpful that we can help give you time and space to work on the workshops without it feeling too overwhelming.
I think you brought up like the individual meetings. I think that would help personally, if it's like not too much for you guys.
No, I'm happy to do them. I was just kind of waiting for you all to reach out to me to ask for them, but okay, so I know we have the breakdown of who was kind of assigned to what project, and I think I sent the email. Would it be helpful if I just reached out to each one of you and set up an individual meeting, maybe from now until next month's meeting, And then next month's monthly meeting, instead of it being this type of lecture based, although I did want to talk about refugees and diaspora, what I'm thinking is maybe I can do that for the first hour, and the second hour is just working on projects. Like even if we're separately working on them together, but kind of like in a virtual space, or if it would help to make it in person, we could make the meeting in person. We do the first hour of a conversation and the second hour kind of individually working on these projects together. And then we would have already met individually, so you have some idea and some sense of already what to get started with.
I really like the idea of the in-person meetings. Just me.
You like in-person? Okay. What about everyone else? Sometimes it's easier to do them online, but sometimes the sense of collectivity helps. So how does everyone feel? First, how does everyone feel about individual meetings before our next monthly one? And then our next monthly one is just an hour of a conversation about refugees and diaspora, and the second hour doing work. Does that sound good? Or do we want the whole monthly meeting to be about doing work? Because I'm okay with that too.
No, I think if we dedicate some time to individual work, that's good.
Okay. Is the hour enough, or do we want to make the whole thing just the workshops?
No, I think just an hour is fine.
Yeah, I think that too.
And then what about in person versus online for the next, it doesn't have to be for all of them. We could just talk about March right now for this like workshop hour of working together.
I think honestly, like it depends on the day.
So it would probably be a Sunday again. I think I tried to standardize them where it's the third Sunday of the month. So that would we'd be looking at March 20th for this. And around the same time, so like 11 to 11. If we want them online, like that's totally fine. Yes, maybe if you like in person, maybe our meeting could be in person. If you're close enough to come to PAC, we could do that. So it's very much up to you all. Is the silence like I don't really care, or the silence like I kind of just want to be in online? It's okay if we want to be online. Honestly, I get it. Sometimes it's easier to just be in your pajamas and do it from home. So it's up to you all.
I don't mind. It's fine.
Yeah, if we could just do in person, and then if you can't make it, you just join online. That could be it. But then you guys have to schedule and find rooms and stuff. So I don't know. I don't have a preference as long as I can make it there.
The room is easy. It would be at PAC. It'd be the same room we did last time. My only thing is I just try to stay away from the hybrid model. Honestly, it gets a bit much. And I don't think we get the same experience as whether everyone's online or everyone's in person. So I'd rather just confirm one.
I think that I'd do it online because I have a lot of dependencies. Like I have a lot of things to depend variables, changing variables, unfortunately.
Of course, yeah.
But yeah, that'd be easier for me, I think.
Okay. What about everyone else? Does online work?
Yeah.
Will we get that same like feeling of work done online, I guess? Okay. All right. So I think we're in agreement. So our next meeting will be March 20th, Sunday, same time, online. I'll send another email, another calendar invite and stuff. In the meantime, I'm going to email everyone reminder of what topic you have. We'll set up either an online or in-person time to meet, to figure out if you need help, just to get you started. Then you'll have a starting point for the March meeting. You're not going to have the workshop done, but you'll have at least an outline or a base to build off of. And then we can jump, we can jump ideas off each other. We can go to separate breakout rooms. We could just literally sit and do the work together and dedicate time for that. Does that sound good? Perfect. So that's kind of everything I had for today. Any last minute things anyone wants to talk about? Last minute check-ins, questions, comments, feelings? Okay. Thank you all for another great conversation. If you need anything from me in the meantime, please feel free to text me or email me or message me. And then, yeah, I will send you all emails and we'll go from there. Bye.
Bye.
Everyone. Have a great
Bye,
day.
thank you.
You're welcome.